What would happen if you found out that the only real fight you have in this lifetime is with yourself? Let's talk about that.
Welcome to When I Stop Fighting, the podcast. My name is Daryl Dittmer. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, Daniel Fendley. Daniel served over 18 years in law enforcement before his life was turned upside down by trauma, addiction, and burnout. Diagnosed with PTSD after years in high-risk policing and child safeguarding, he spiraled into self-destruction before entering rehab and beginning a long road to recovery. Now a writer and advocate, Daniel shares his raw and unflinching story through his memoirs, Four-Letter Word, Unprescribed, and Wounded in Uniform, exploring the human cost of service, the silence around mental health, and the power of letting go. His journey is one of collapse, awakening, and rebuilding, proof that healing is possible even after losing everything. Welcome, Daniel. Thanks so much for coming on.
First and foremost, Daryl, thank you very much for that intro. It still hits me when I hear it from someone else. So I really, really appreciate it. And additionally, it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be with you today. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that. We were talking a little bit before we hit record, and I had mentioned that I come from a family of police officers and firefighters and that sort of thing, and I appreciate what you have done and what you have gone through, and thank you for your service.
I appreciate. Thank you.
So, there's so many things that we can get involved in this lifetime, and my personal opinion is one of the most difficult things that a person can undertake from a profession perspective is, and it's kind of interesting to say it, but it's helping others in that policing and in that sort of dangerous environment, in the difficult environment, being challenged every single day with what, not knowing what to expect, right? And so I give you so much credit for doing that and pursuing that and for doing it as long as you did. If you wouldn't mind, Daniel, I'd love to hear your story, and if you can go back as far as you want in terms of how you came up and how you got into policing, et cetera, and then how you're doing what you do now and why you're doing what you do now. And we'll take it from there.
All right, Daryl, thank you very much. I think the easiest thing to talk about my story is to essentially try and start at the beginning, before the collapse, before the chaos, and essentially before my life was literally turned upside down. I think if I look back now, even from an early age, I grew up in London till the age of about 17. But I was also always searching for some sort of purpose. I had this constant need to do something meaningful, to have a purpose. And as I got older, that constant drive to sort of prove myself, always had that sense of seeking validation that was always in the background of my mind. And I think as it turned over, my work ethic would go through the roof. But even though I was earning little successes in my career, my employment, I was never content. I was always searching for the next and the next and the next. And that burning desire continued into my adulthood. When I moved over to the south of Spain, and I was struggling with, again, that purpose. I did the odd jobs. I joined the army for a short spate of time. And then I saw an article for the local police establishment here in Gibraltar, and I didn't think twice. I joined, wholeheartedly. And at the time, I was wide-eyed, bushy-tailed. I couldn't imagine the sort of extent of policing that you would have to go through. Considering, I'll set the scene. It's based, sunny skies, very calm, very little crime, or so you'd think. But slowly but surely, that work ethic carried on. And unfortunately, you get to a stage where you start seeing the worst in humanity. And back then, I didn't really know how to process it. Again, and like I say, I don't like to place blame or point fingers, but there was an internal sort of unspoken culture within, and I think it's rife within all law enforcement and within social circles everywhere, that sense of showing any vulnerability is always seen as some sort of weakness. And my biggest fear was that fear of judgment, the fear that I wasn't strong enough to keep going and show resilience and stuff. So I kept bottling it in and literally driving through. And as the years progressed, I was unknowingly taking on all of this sort of trauma related to high risk exposure, but I didn't have a void to sort of branch it out. So essentially, what I was doing was packing it into a suitcase, just year after year, week after week, until one day I had to hold my hand up. I said I had to hold my hand up because it was at that point my drinking had gotten out of control. My decision makings were extremely questionable, and I didn't know which way to turn. And I know the term. I was literally running on empty. I was a high performing alcoholic. I could function, but I was never present. I wasn't really. I could do the job, but I wasn't really copus maintenance about anything. And then that continued when I came home. I was here. I was present, but I wasn't here. My mind was always somewhere else. So the day when I asked for some support from my employment, unfortunately, it wasn't. To be fair, I don't know what I expected. I expected something, but I think what hurt the most was the silence that came from it. And I think it was more to do with they didn't know how to deal with it, more than a case of that they couldn't help me. They tried, but they couldn't understand. Again, there is, and this is, I'm only talking about maybe a couple of years ago, but there was that stigma where there was massive question marks, like, how can a police officer that has been in for so long in the high risking roles be so broken to this extent that is even fit to be a police officer at the moment? And that was the issue. That was my main fear, and it was coming to light more and more. So instead of reaching out and trying to push further for some support and showing that level of vulnerability, I sort of backstepped a bit, to the extent where I wouldn't project I wouldn't disclose how far I felt I was going down the rabbit hole. So then that prolonged into many, many months, until, again, like I say, it just fell apart. And then my rock bottom wasn't literally when I lost everything. My rock bottom was when, thankfully, I said to myself, look, you cannot be defined by your career. You can't be only Danny the police officer and all the rest of it. Your health, your family, everything needs to come into. And if I carried on, I would have lost something. Or worst case scenario, I would no longer be here. So at that point I self-declared myself into rehab recovery for alcoholism, sex addiction, porn, drugs, you name it. I somehow got involved in that way. And then whilst I was there, rehab in itself was it's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. I don't know. When I spoke to a few people that had gone through it, they painted the picture like it was a spa, like it was a break. But I didn't need a break. I needed it to strip down all of my preconceptions and behaviors, which is exactly what happened. The hard part for me was that the only local rehab center that there was in Gibraltar, obviously there were a lot of known faces for me, so that made my journey into recovery slightly more difficult than expected at the beginning. But also what it did do at the same time, it showed to them and myself that, that I was one, I was human. There was no facade, there was no uniform, there was no badge to hide behind. And evidently that, I think it changed a lot of people's perception about addiction, because addiction doesn't discriminate, you know. On the outside, I looked like I had everything all together. I've got a great family, had a good career. Wasn't seeking for a dependency or to be addicted in any way, but it just sort of crept up on me, and it was the little things that came. And then it was only through therapy that once I got referred to a psychologist and then a psychiatrist, and it was only after telling my story that I sort of suppressed that the reasons why I was running to alcohol or got addicted in the way that I did was untreated trauma. And the problem was, when I got diagnosed with PTSD at the time, he felt I should have some sort of relief, but it wasn't relief. It was probably the last thing I wanted to hear, because I felt such an idiot that I couldn't see it coming, and that I didn't stop it. That was the major point for me. But I've come to realize now through recovery and therapy and stuff that, you know, trauma in itself, if left untreated, it'll always find a way out. And all of those years of packing that suitcase, it eventually exploded, where the time I didn't know how to deal with it, apart from escape, numbing, suppressing, those are all automatic feelings that I felt I needed to do to literally survive. And essentially that's what my recovery was all about, because my recovery has never been perfect. I wasn't seeking perfection, but it was about honesty. And when I finally stopped running or trying to escape or suppress and looking for a way to not feel how I was feeling, I think that's when the true healing sort of began, realistically, for me. And that's essentially where I am now. You know, I've tried to turn that pain, that suffering to stop. That's my new purpose. Instead of seeking for validations, instead of chasing medals and titles and success, I've changed that, not to make me feel better for that small bit of validation, but what can I do for others? Because I remember now being in similar shoes and wishing that I had somebody with, not that I wish that somebody had gone through what I had to go through, but at least to have that option where somebody can empathize with me and know what it is and identify the certain things where I was blinded to it. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do now, is find an element of peace in my authenticity and living basically with meaning more than an image. That's where I am at the moment, and it's serving me extremely well. So sorry, I believe it might have rambled on, but that's essentially my story, Daryl.
No, that's great, Daniel. And I appreciate you telling your story. It's so crucial for us to hear others' stories and to know that there's a way to get better and to experience life in a different way. And the only way that people can know that is to hear our stories. Something that's really crucial for me is, because we all have different stories. You and I have different stories. You know, everybody who's gone through any sort of recovery or therapy or whatever it is, everybody's got a different story. Out in the world, our story is different. But in here, many times it's fears and it's dishonesty and it's all those things that just sort of, you said packing the suitcase, and I like that way of looking at it, because we just keep packing these things. If we're not improving and we're continuing to experience the difficulties and the traumas and all that sort of stuff, and we're fomenting that as we go along, we're just continuing to pack the suitcase. And the only way to get better, I'm going to use this again because I love to pack the suitcase, we have to unpack the suitcase. We have to allow ourselves to experience the world and to feel not even feel in a different way, just feel.
Feel no stuff. Exactly.
Yeah, the way that becomes different for us is to stop plying ourselves with the addictions, right? To keep, stop packing that suitcase. So So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of unpacking the suitcase. What does that look like for you, and what does that look like for the people that you look to help through these issues?
For me, it was essentially that the back of the suitcase in itself, because for me it wasn't one big sort of explosion for me. It was more like everything slowly was sort of collapsing around me and essentially within me. And it was my work, my health, my debt, that was all starting to sort of unravel. And then instead of like you say, facing it head on and trying to become comfortable in uncomfortable situations or emotions, I was using alcohol and other addictions to sort of keep myself functioning, and eventually I couldn't keep up the act. That's essentially it, because sooner or later you are going to slip up, whether intentionally or not. The eyes, like they say, they never lie, because there is many truths behind an addict's eyes and stuff. But it got to the point, I think essentially it got to the point where my outer layer or armor, so to speak, it started cracking and then it started seeping. And it was just those slow acknowledgements. And now when I look back, and I don't regret a lot of the things that happened, because I think I wouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't gone through the journey that I've gone through. But there are levels of frustration when you think, when you look back, and hindsight is a beautiful thing, when it's 3 years later and you start identifying certain things, but you weren't at the time, you weren't in the right state of mind to be able to self-reflect or introspectively look at things and go, oh, yes, that was a highlight, because you don't see it. Others around you can see it clear as day, but then they also have their own fears. They don't want fear of conflict, fear of judgment and stuff. So it's a very, very vicious cycle that you have to go through. But ultimately, because like now when I work in recovery or I help others in similar situations, I also acknowledge that you can't force recovery. You can't force somebody to get better. That decision lies within themselves, and that's unfortunately some of the problems that we've got, especially locally, when people are forced to go into rehab and they go through the motions, but internally, mostly they're not there, and you have to let them, give them the time, because when the time does come and they want it, you need that 110% inside to just change all of your perception and have that self-belief to disregard that uniqueness, that you're the only one in the world that's having these problems, and be around like-minded people in recovery, people that are I call it in the old timers. Surround yourself with good people and stuff. Don't surround yourself with naysayers or people that question whether you've got a problem, or is it, or maybe you're a bit tired, mate. You're exhausted. Drink. You haven't got a problem. Those are the issues, because sooner or later, if you start believing those little temptations and you haven't, you start negotiating with yourself again, and then the whole cycle starts again, and you miss the whole point of why you was here in the beginning. So that's essentially it for me. But now, luckily, if you would have seen me a couple of years ago, I would have probably said, I've got everything under control. I'm very functional in that. But I was essentially running 100 miles an hour, like that Duracell battery that you see. And I think that also played a part in my sort of demise, where I was sort of a prisoner to my own pride. Like I would refuse to give up. And that's why I did so well in my career, because of that validation, because I needed to get to where I needed to get to. I needed to make a difference. I needed to help as many people as I could. And that's all well and good. But if you can't look after yourself, you're no good to no one. And it took me so long to realize that, because I could help the most worst in need. I would bend over backwards. I would climb through wall, absolutely anything. But when it came to looking after myself, I didn't give it a second guess. And that was essentially, it was hard. So as much as I know that the exposure and the trauma and the lack of support in certain extents, I also have to recognize that I had a big part to play in this whole problem as well, and because I think that's important for a lot of people. Because if you don't, then you're not really being honest with the whole situation. If you're starting to point fingers and, you know, it was your decisions and all the rest of it. And once you start accepting those challenges and decisions, whether right or wrong, whether intentionally or not, then you can start to process that change and that healing and that change, that little shift in mindset where you don't see only negative. Now you can concentrate on positives, however small they are. Enjoy them.
Yeah.
Because that's where, you know, I was so far ahead at the time, looking miles away, looking all the way up the road. Where am I going to be in 10 miles, instead of just seeing where am I going to be in the next mile now? And that's what I do now, step by step. And I think one of the best things I do now, just for my own peace of mind and reflection, now to help me not overthink or be overwhelmed and stuff, I'll do certain things, like I'll leave the phone at home, or I won't social media ban it or whatever. And I'll literally just go for a walk, whether that's along the beachfront or in a forest. Because I'm a big believer in nature, and that's my spirituality is within nature, because that speaks to me so much. And it speaks to me so much more because out there I'm content with my own thoughts and feelings. And I know that whether I'm at the beach, along the sea, or whether I'm in the forest, that forest or the sea doesn't want anything from me. I don't need anything to prove to anybody. I can enjoy that moment. And that's served me very, very well to sort of ground myself in since the last times I've been through. So I'm a big believer in getting yourself out there with nature.
For sure. I couldn't agree more, Daniel. I you know, this morning I was, we live up in the mountains in Georgia in the US, and, you know, we get up early often, and especially this time of year, because it's kind of cool in the morning, and we'll just sit outside and we'll be quiet, my wife and I, and we'll look up at the stars and just, you know, allow ourselves to take it all in, and you know, it might be an hour, might be an hour and a half, you know, just whatever time we get up to when it starts to turn light. And it's one of the most beautiful things because it allows us to slow down. It allows us to start our day in quiet mode, as opposed to, oh, where's my phone? You know, I got to check this, and I got to check that, and I got to look at this, and I got to look at that. And you brought up some really interesting things, and things that I agree with 100%. And I think it's crucial from a recovery perspective. One was, we used to call it, when I was first coming around, and I was 19 when I got sober. So I was a kid. I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue how to live. I didn't have a clue how to not do things under the influence of something, whatever. But they told me when I came in, they said, when you change the game, you got to change the players, which I think is exactly what you're talking about in terms of, you know, I can't hang around the same people. I can't do the same sort of things and the same influences. I have to do things differently. And which brings me to another thing that you said, which I think is crucial, is honesty with ourselves. We have to get to a point, because nobody's going to change, in my opinion, and I haven't seen it, and I've been doing this for a while. Nobody's going to change until they are sick and tired of their own BS. You know, they have to be sick and tired of their own crap. And I think that's absolutely crucial, you know, to understand in terms of helping people, but also in terms of, you know, me extending myself to someone else. I will do that if I know that they are willing to change, if they've gotten to that place. And the other thing I think, which is crucial, is responsibility. I have to take 100% responsibility for my life. I can't take responsibility for everything that happens outside of me because life happens, but I can take responsibility for how I'm approaching my life and how I am approaching others and how I'm approaching the world. So you've hit so many important things, Daniel. I think it's wonderful, to listen to what you're saying. And have you been involved in the 12 steps, or did you get involved in the 12 steps from a recovery perspective, or was it another avenue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one because initially the 12 steps, and I'm a big believer of the 12 steps and all the rest of it. But at the time of when my initial recovery, I had this resistance, I like to call it, towards religion and Jesus or God or whoever, because my perspective was, well, where was he when my whole life was falling apart? And it was the whole looking for excuses, somebody to blame. So it took me a while. But what I did initially was I didn't do the 12 steps the traditional way, but I did the alternative, which is essentially the exact same way, but because of my pain in the ass, I didn't want the word God in it. But now I've got no issues whatsoever. I have found, but it really, really took me a while. But I think it was because I was so resistant to the fact that, and self-pride and ego, whatever you want to, they're all factors where initially when I went in, I still needed somebody to blame, and it still needed it. This couldn't have all been my failure, which essentially it was. And not, my whole recovery, it wasn't entirely my fault. I never asked to be an alcoholic. I never, nobody does. Nobody wakes up and says, "Oh, I want to be one." But it's essentially exactly what you said. I'm not, I might not be responsible for all of the things that have happened to me, but I'm definitely responsible for my recovery in the way that I want to live the rest of my life. And that's on me. I can start pointing fingers and asking the fairy godmother to come with a little wand and start. But that's not reality. And for me, I think the big realization was that I didn't, being in rehab itself and doing the 12 steps and getting a sponsor, that's not where I started recovery. I started recovery when I left rehab, when I went back into the real world, because that was, when you're in rehab, you're surrounded by, like I say, like-minded people going through the same struggles, and you are essentially in a bubble with counselors, people, helpers, therapy, abstinence, because there is no temptation. You can't even drink coffee where I was. You had to drink herbal tea, and I would love the stuff. But it was the day, that's what I think where I feared the most, the day that I left, because I knew the world didn't stop. It doesn't stop because Dan's gone to rehab. And when I came out, I also realized that when I came out, there wasn't going to be no confetti gun or a round of applause or a marching band. Nobody cared, apart from obviously my close family. But that's where the real sort of progress and process had to go through. And I knew essentially for me, it was all of three things. I knew I needed to be consistent. I knew I needed to be committed, because I think with the commitment and the commitment with consistency creates progress. And it doesn't mean that's like now and that's what I do every day. But with me in itself, I've stopped counting now for long days. I used to, because every AA meeting, I would count the days that I've been sober. But now I don't. I mean, if you ask me, I can tell you the year, but I don't look at it, because for me, there is no finish line for me. There is no X amount of numbers, that I've run across the finish line and there's some sort of celebration. This is me now. So, but I've come to terms with, that's okay. I think I made it such a bigger thing that it needed to be in the initial start of either recovery or rehab, because I didn't know how to live without, not necessarily with drink or drugs, but how to live without that option. If I couldn't fall back on this, how am I going to process it? And the truth is, you do, because guess what? You don't have a choice. You have to sit with it, and it's never as bad as I thought. There were bad times. Don't get me wrong. And again, like I say, I had to go through therapy, but I'm not ashamed of it anymore. And I think a big factor of that is especially with the alcoholism and all the rest, was the shame base that's around it. But what I've also found to realize is shame is only as powerful if you don't share it. And like I say, that people think that being vulnerable or showing vulnerability means showing a moment of weakness or not being as strong as people first perceive. Far from it. Vulnerability is, for me, opening up about some issues with having the fear that you're going to be judged, but then that's reciprocated when it's come back with either acceptance, empathy, or some sort of support. Again, all of it is all fear-based, but yeah, shame. The shame that surrounds you when you come out or when you're going through it, you can strip it. You can cut the snake's head off, as they say, as long as you're open and honest about it. I mean, if you can't be honest and open about it, then you're still struggling inside, and you need to release that emotion to get those. Like, my emotions were like they were all over the place, and no one had the stop button. But I found out I don't search for perfection, like I've said. I don't even search for happiness, because I know with happiness there's a sadness. Essentially what I'm looking and what I try and live my day to day with now is being content. Am I sitting here today and am I content? Yes. That's it. I don't need to search for anything else, and I don't need to. I'm just happy with literally being within the present moment, and that's how I live my life.
That's great. Yeah, I love to hear that. And, the vulnerability thing, I went to this and I couldn't agree more. I believe, for men, it's a difficult thing, and we're not supposed to, especially if we've grown up in maybe a tougher environment or whatever it is with family and that sort of thing. And it's hard to show our emotions. And for the most part, we're taught not to. In my opinion, I was taught to perform, whether it was grades or sports or whatever it was. Then it was work, and it sounds very similar in your situation. But that's what I was taught to do, is perform. And if you perform well, then we care about you, we love you. And it wasn't that stark, it wasn't like, oh, you stink until you perform, but it was. If you do well, you get the hugs and the accolades and all the stuff, and so that's been something I've carried with me my entire life, but it's okay now because I allow myself at times to not perform. I allow myself to settle down. I allow myself to be quiet. I allow myself to cry. I allow myself to do things that I wouldn't normally have done, over the years. And I went to it was like a weekend. It was called Deep Waters Experience. And it's a lot of people in recovery, but it really is about being vulnerable. And man, that was one of the coolest experiences of my life. And I've become more and more vulnerable over the years, and have felt many things, and grief and shame and all those things, and have had those outpourings of emotion. But this was like a concentrated version, and it was powerful, man. And it was great to be able to experience that with other people that I don't know, men, and having them experience the same thing. It was the opposite of weakness, in my opinion, because being able to show ourselves is the opposite of weakness, I think. And it sounds like you think similarly in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I think evidently, that in itself is a true strength. I think all the rest are all external factors. I mean, like you did with your deep waters thing. It was only a couple of weeks ago. I was in the mountains with. This might sound a bit weird, but I was up in the mountains with a load of burly men, and essentially we was doing the deep breath work, and there was tears and there was shouting, and there's a few hikers that came around. There was a few eyebrows raised, like, what the hell was going on here? But for us, it was so normal, and it was, again, it's so rewarded when you can share that sort of vulnerability, shall I say, and there's no stigma with it, because everyone's going through the same sort of level, and there's no judgment, and it's a very, very safe space. It doesn't mean that we all skip around and cry at every given moment, but there's it's that release. Is that release instead of what I'd done for so many years, the suppression and trying to keep everything in. Now I can when I need to, I can let it go, and that's it. Once it's gone, the power's gone. So that little things like that, they work wonders if you allow them to. But you've got to take, you've got to strip off that ego, that sense of pride. Like, oh, that's not for me. I'm not hugging no guy in the woods and crying like crazy.
Right.
It works. Believe me.
Yeah. No, it's awesome, man. I love to hear that, especially. I was, we didn't grow up in the same sort of environment probably, but it was expected of me to be tough, and that was it. And that was that. I was a man. I was expected to be tough. My dad was tough. My family was tough. That's just the way it was. And I have learned since that being tough isn't the answer. I don't mind. I do believe it's important to have a strong mind and a strong heart and not give in to temptation and all that sort of thing. But if it's time to let it go and it's time to feel something, the life will show us that that's what time it is. And I can either constrict and shut down, or I can allow it to flow. And for me, more often than not these days, I allow it to just come out, and it's a wonderful thing. So this brings me to the next, I think, really important for me over the years has been, I am not in any way bummed out by the fact that I, chose drugs and alcohol and, debauchery and all kinds of crap years and years ago. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me. And people would say, oh, well, what do you mean by that? And I feel like I would not have had the opportunity to be different that I have had in these last, many years. I don't know that I would have had that opportunity or that I would have taken advantage of the opportunity to live a different life had those things not happened in my life. So I couldn't be more grateful for the difficulties and the failures and, what we call failures, or what I would have called failures back then. I couldn't be more excited about the fact that life is really incredible now, because of my issues in the past. And it sounds like you feel similarly, Daniel, in terms of that gratitude.
Yeah, I can 100% resonate with that. Like I say, I think there's sometimes a misconception that, whether through recovery or through grief or an array of issues, that life sometimes is hard. There's no escaping it. But the difference with me is now is, I can't, again, like we've covered the point, I can't control what happens or what's thrown at me, or what I might have to deal with. But what I can control is how I react to it. And that's essentially how I deal with things. But again, I resonate with what you said 100%. I completely align with that. If I hadn't have gone through the journey of what I literally got to here today, every time that life threw, sorry for the phrase, a shovel of shit on me, I would probably deal with it so many different ways. But whereas now I can, even if I'm blindsided with it and it's caught me off guard, I'm still able now, because I'm clean-minded and sort of fresh. I can still sit with that uncomfortability. I can still process it. I don't need to work on impulse or a protective mode. I can sit with it. And that applies to everyone else. If something bad happens with someone else, I don't have to run and save them. We can sit and we can talk through it, and we can validate options, see what there is, if anything needs to be done. So I think it's all about that. Sometimes in life, we're in such a rush to get to somewhere, whether it's, career or life, or that sometimes we don't sit and actually evaluate certain things, everything else, or whether it's fear-based, because they feel that there is no time in the world left to do it. If they don't do it now, they won't do it. But, sometimes just pausing, even 30 seconds before doing anything, before making any decision, before making any reaction, it works wonders, and it has for me. And I think if that's anything to go by, that again, like I said, that would have never happened 4 or 5 years ago when I was before I went into recovery. Everything was on impulse.
Right. Absolutely. I feel like there's an ability to experience life now, as opposed to just react to it. And you had mentioned earlier about religion and that sort of thing. And I'm 100% with you, in terms of, it was something that was difficult for me to get my head around, because I was brought up with religion, and they said, okay, well, here's the God you have to believe in, and if you don't do all the right stuff, here's what's going to happen to you. If you do all the right stuff, and I don't know what the hell the right stuff is, because that seemed to change all the time. Yeah. So what is all this stuff that I'm supposed to do to keep myself from going to this terrible place forever? Like, what is that? I just, that never resonated with me. So I had to take those conceptions that I had and look at them and say, do I need to change some of this? Because I don't want to live in a way where I'm constantly afraid of this whatever in the sky, God in the sky, who's, writing down all this bad stuff that I do. I don't want to be subject to that. I don't want to feel guilty. I don't want to be scared. So I had to peel all that stuff away and start thinking about life differently. And I guess and it continues to change. You had mentioned earlier about there is no finish line. And I don't 100% agree. There is no finish line. I'm just going to be, when I'm finally sliding into home plate, I'm hoping it's head first, and and then when it ends. But until that time, I am open to my beliefs changing. I am open to myself changing and continuing to, just move more and more toward, number one, you mentioned it, contentment and fulfillment, which I think are really beautiful things that sort of encompass our whole being and our whole life. But also, how can I help other people with, potentially, if they're ready, finding contentment and finding fulfillment. And so you're writing books, you're helping people. I love the titles of your books. 4-letter word. That's Unprescribed and Wounded in Uniform. That's really, really cool. Could you tell us a little bit about those books and how they came about and what they're about?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for bringing them up, though. Funnily enough, I never in a million years thought I'd write a book ever. let alone publish it, and let alone anybody ever reading it and giving reviews. But again, it's a funny old life when you get your shit in order. It all started essentially within the last 2 weeks of rehab. I'd done all of the hard work, all of the essential bits that I needed to do, and I was essentially clock watching, just processing. And I started putting pen to paper. And it was only because my psychologist, who was extremely nosy, he said, why don't you use it as a form of therapy? Because you've got so much in, again, like I say, this suitcase that it's sort of exploding eventually at moments. He said, why don't you just write it down as best as you can? It doesn't have to be in chronological order, but just put it into there. So essentially, that's exactly what it was. I was turning my pain or my suffering. I was turning pain and suffering into literally words on a page. First in a way to sort of process everything, and then once they were all out, it was essentially like pulling the poison out, so to speak. And I started feeling a little bit lighter, and it gave that pain, it gave that suffering a bit of, again, purpose. There's reasons behind it, and I could process it more, and it helped me understand. Essentially, it helped me understand my own sort of journey, and I realized if I could turn that sort of darkness, should I say, into something not necessarily positive, but if I turn it into something that will maybe one day help somebody else, then for me it was always worth it. And I know people say that all the time, but it was always going to be worth it. So Unprescribed was essentially the story, or my memoir rather, of before my collapse, and how little things that I should have seen, or what were happening, or life around me were edging me through into darker addiction, dependency. And then it basically scriptured how I felt and my journey through recovery. And then Four Letter Word is a whole nother story on what led to my PTSD diagnosis. And again, it wasn't something that I essentially wanted to put on paper, because it's extremely emotional, and it's raw, it's unfiltered. However, I was so torn between, I felt that the message needed to be said. Not for me, not to justify my own, sort of existence, or anything, to give that level of perhaps information to somebody struggling with the same sort of symptoms that I were, and struggling not to feel that they can come forward, or to help people identify some of the certain, or perhaps not, but it was there. And then Wounded in Uniform is essentially my whole life story, which is not out at the moment, so it's still in progress. It's still a work in progress, but it follows the same theme, but there's at the same time, within all of the memoirs, it's not all doom and gloom. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There is moments of suicide, ideation, and all the rest, because that comes with it. It's an unfortunate part of my recovery itself, when you think you're left with no option. So it's another reminder, that tomorrow's another day. And what you was dealing with yesterday's problem. You keep moving forward, no matter what. We can do it.
That's great. And thank you for talking about your books. I am going to. So if you were going to recommend one for me, I'm kind of feeling a little drawn toward Unprescribed. So I will definitely get that and read it. And I'm excited to do that. Your story is powerful, but I also very much resonate with how you have gone about, working with your recovery and working with yourself and taking responsibility and all of those things, which are so absolutely crucial. did a lot of writing when I was younger too, and when I was just coming up in recovery, and my brain was just exploding, and my emotions were exploding, and I didn't know what was going on. So I just took a yellow legal pad and I just started writing and writing and writing and writing. And it was crucial for me therapeutically, and I wasn't in therapy, but people mentioned, you know, writing is really helpful. I was like, okay, I'll do that. And it was amazing how when it went from here and here to paper, everything seemed to calm down. Everything, you know, even if it was just for a short period of time, it just seemed to calm down until the next time I had to do it. And it sounds like you found that to be true for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't an easy process. Sometimes writing about yourself is never easy, because it's you know, it's your mind recalling things, and essentially it's your story that your mind is telling you about. It's a different, you know. So, yeah. But again, it's like you've mentioned, it's about peeling back that sort of emotional onion, and what I've tried to do. I mean, at the first stages when I was in rehab, I mean, I went through about I don't know 40 pens within a weekend, because I was just writing. But then luckily I was able to sort of sit back, review it all, and then start not from fresh, but reintroducing things. And I took out all the emotion from it, because I knew at the beginning I was just writing angry, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. But once you strip it back and you look at it as the facts that they are, and you know about how your story is, and you're not self-critical, and you're not self-judgmental, and it just reads as it reads. There's a lot of power in that, and it's again, it's like I say, it works. It served me so well, because it was getting that internal pain onto paper. And I think once I wrote it down, whether I read it out loud or I read it to myself, it took away that power, that internal discomfort, because I've shared it, whether because it's on paper or not. It didn't feel like I was holding it in, and I'm a big believer, like they say in recovery. You know, you're only sick as your secrets, and if you keep everything in, you can't expect to get it. You know, you can't expect to get better anytime soon. You need to fully release. So that's essentially what I did, and long may it continue. If I don't want anything worse to happen to me to put pen to paper, but look, my story is not over yet, so I'm sure there's plenty to come.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, no, I can feel like there's definitely plenty to come. I think it's great. I haven't heard that in a long time, and I love that saying, "You're only as sick as your secrets." And sometimes that freaks people out when I've said it. They're like, "Oh man, really?" I'm like, "Well, yeah. If we're hiding, right? If we're hiding, there's pain. There's pain involved in hiding, and that's just is what it is. And it doesn't matter what I'm hiding. If that little voice is saying, you know, hey, you're hiding, you need to address this, you need to look at it, you need to think about it, you need to share it, you need to whatever, that little voice is right. And me continuing to stuff that down and not come out with it, whether it's on paper or another human being or whatever it is definitely detrimental to my growth and my recovery and my moving forward. So yeah, I could not agree more. So how do we find you, Daniel? I'm going to put everything in the show notes in terms of, all about your books. How do we find your books? How do we find you? How do we find the work that you're doing in helping people recover?
Well, I appreciate that. You can find me. I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn because I'm not very good with social media. I've taken a bit of a break, but you can find me on Instagram, especially in relation to the books and the memoirs, which is under the Wounded series, which is the _wounded_ series. Drop me a DM or send me a message, and I'll be sure to be able to get in contact with you there again. The books are available on Amazon within the KDP thing, and they're also available in some bookstores, some good bookstores, and also some really rubbish ones apparently. But if anything, Daryl, I'm really, like I say, I know we're shutting down now. I just wanted to take this moment to one, show my appreciation again for the invitation. Absolutely a privilege. And I just wanted to echo one of the things that you opened up with, because I love that saying. That for me, the funny thing was when I stopped fighting the world and everybody in it, that I realized the whole time I'd been fighting myself. And that's such a strong, powerful message that you start with. And it's such a resonates with me so much. So once again, I thank you so much, Dal.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate that. And I was going to ask one more question. And that is, if you were to give, your advice is so sound, and I love to hear it, but if you're going to give a new person who was willing to change one piece of advice in terms of their best idea to move their recovery forward, what would that be?
It's a good question. I don't want to leave it right. I think the best advice I could give is to perhaps try to live in a place of peace and not self-punishment, no matter how hard the struggle, and accept a quiet acceptance in being who you are. Because I think once you do that, that's where the true healing begins.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And it takes some peeling, right? Some peeling away and dropping preconceived notions and to find that peace within ourselves. But I will say, and I love that you said that, because there's this self, while we're drinking and drugging and doing all the addiction stuff, that isn't our real self. We think it is, but it's not. It's not our real self. The real self is peace and inside it's contentment, it's fulfillment. And what we have to do is uncover that, because you said earlier, it's under a pile of shit, and it can be under several piles of shit. But once we get rid of the shit, we can start to find ourselves, and ourselves are peace. That's what we're designed for.
Absolutely.
And it's difficult in this world, honestly. In this world, we get addicted to distraction, and we get addicted to, everything but taking care of ourselves. So that's very sound advice, Daniel, and I really appreciate it. I know my listeners will appreciate that, and thank you so much for coming on. And I didn't say this in the beginning, but you reached out to me, which I thought was just spectacular, and I really appreciate that you did that a couple of weeks ago, and I'm so glad that we had a chance to talk. And I want to continue to stay in touch, because there's a lot of people that, and this isn't necessarily a judgment, but just people that I resonate with in terms of their approach and their recovery and how they're living and the genuine, authentic nature. And to me, you resonate with me in that regard. And so I appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Daryl, mate. It's been emotional, that's for sure, but it's been extremely rewarding. So I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you bringing me on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed When I Stopped Fighting the podcast, please check out my books and my journals on my website, daryldittmer.com. Enjoy a 15% discount by using the code PODCAST, DARYLDITTMER.com. Thanks again.